Good morning, everyone. My name is Debra Thompson. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Vice President Academic and Provost here at Royal Roads University. While President Steenkamp is unable to join us today, I'm thrilled to be taking on the role of your MC. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Debra Thompson, today's presenter, who I will be introducing shortly. I'd also like to welcome and share my thanks to Associate Director of Human Rights and Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, Alejandro Campos Garcia, who organized today's session, which I know will be a very engaging talk. And of course, welcome to all of you. It's with much appreciation that I recognize this morning that our campus is located on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and it is with deep gratitude that we live, work, and learn here where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Microphones have been muted to begin today, but you can ask questions using the chat, and there's a dedicated question and answer session towards the end of the talk this morning. Feel free to leave your cameras on or off, but it's always nice to see a few friendly faces when presenting in a virtual environment, as we're in this morning. Black History Month, for those of you who were with us at yesterday's fascinating event with Carl E. James, where we talked, he shared about the history and significance of Black History Month itself. You will have heard some of this that I'm about to share, but it does bear repeating for those of us who weren't able to join yesterday afternoon. Throughout the month of February, Royal Roads has been celebrating Black History Month by sharing resources, stories, and voices from our university community and beyond. We launched the month with a video featuring students from across programs and across the world. They spoke not only about what this month means to them, but also what brings them joy and pride as Black people living in Canada. That video and each of their voices are featured on our Black History Month webpage. So I encourage you to have a look if you haven't had a chance to yet. There you will also find the Royal Roads University Library's digital display, which showcases work by Black creators covering Black Canadian history, contemporary experiences, culture, post-secondary life, women in leadership, film and fiction, and much more. As many of you are aware, the theme of this year's Black History Month in Canada is Black Excellence, a heritage to celebrate, a future to build. Today, Dr. Thompson will present on Blackness and belonging in North America through an intimate exploration of the roots of Black identities. So now I am pleased to welcome leading scholar of comparative politics of race, Dr. Debra Thompson. Dr. Thompson is Associate Professor in McGill University's Department of Political Science, and she holds a Canada Research Chair in Racial Inequality in Democratic Societies and focuses on studying the intricate connections between race, the state, and inequality in Canada and other democratic societies. Dr. Thompson completed her PhD at the University of Toronto, held a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University, and taught in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University before moving to the University of Oregon to help build its Black Studies program. An award-winning author, her first book, The Schematic State, Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census, examines how the census has evolved from managing and controlling racial populations in the past to its current role as a crucial source of statistical information, tracking the shifts in its purpose over time. Her best-selling second book, The Long Road Home on Blackness and Belonging, won numerous accolades, including being named one of Indigo's top 100 books. CBC's Best Nonfiction of 2022, the Hill Times Top 100 Books of 2022, and the Canadian Political Science Association's Donald Smiley Prize for the best book on Canadian politics. So we are immensely grateful to have her here to speak with us today. Please give a warm, warm welcome to Dr. Debra Thompson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am going to share my screen, and also I have just noticed that I am not on McGill's Wi-Fi. I'm on some random Montreal Wi-Fi, and so fingers crossed it doesn't kick me off. Okay, I assume that you can all see that okay? Great. So I'm really happy to be here. This is material from my second book, which is called The Long Road Home. And let us begin at the beginning. So once upon a time, a few mistakes ago, I was living in a faraway place called Oregon. Perhaps you have heard of it. It's a really beautiful place. It's breathtakingly beautiful and kind of unique in many ways. If you cross the state from the east to the west, it's like crossing the threshold of different alien environments. And there are seething ideological divisions in the state which seem to mimic those discordant environments. So it was January 2020, back before most of us had heard of anything like COVID. And like many Americans, I was appalled at the way the Trump administration had been stretching the norms of democratic rule. And like many Black Americans, I was wholly unsurprised by the emboldened white supremacy of Trump's followers. And at the time, in January of 2020, I was sure that Trump was going to win a second term in office. And by that point, I had already decided to leave the US, where I'd lived for over a decade, and someone from the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History reached out to me. The museum used this fundraiser. It was a faculty seminar series, essentially, held at a local pub in Eugene, Oregon. And the program administrator reached out, and she asked me if I would be interested in presenting my research to this wide audience. And I told her that I had no research because my new research on Black Lives Matter was just getting started, and I had 2 small children and no parental leave because America is a cruel society in that way. But I was moving back to Canada, and I had a lot of feelings about it. So could I possibly present on that instead? And she said, sure, whatever you want. And so the title of my presentation that night was something like Return Some Incoherent Ideas About Race, Democracy, and Going Back Home Again. And to my great surprise, the room was packed. There were hundreds of people there, and the audience was captivated. This was surprising in part because Americans do not care about Canada in the least. And yet so many of them had showed up to hear me talk about what it was like to grow up as a Black Canadian and then live as a Black American for years, and then to be returning home again. What was familiar, what was different, what was inspiring, and what felt hopeless between being Black in Canada versus the US. And it occurred to me that maybe there was something there. And so that talk became this article on the left, which was published in the Globe and Mail on June 6, 2020, at the same time that the kinetic uprising sparked by the murder of George Floyd spread like wildfire across the country and the continent. And that article became the basis for this book. Many drafts later, because sometimes writing is messy and you learn as you write. And like Neil Gaiman once wrote, sometimes the price of getting what you want is getting what once you wanted. And so that talk, that article, my book, all begin with something my dad said in those early days of 2020, as I was talking to him on the phone and I was lamenting something about the Trump presidency. And he said to me, you know, Debra, your daughter was the first Thompson born in the United States since Cornelius Thompson escaped slavery. It's been over 150 years, and some days I think we came back too soon. And I couldn't get his words out of my head. They just struck me. So a little bit of backstory. My dad was born and spent most of his childhood in Shrewsbury, Ontario. It's a tiny town, like 50 miles east of Detroit on the shores of Lake Erie. It and other neighboring towns like Buxton and Dresden were among the last stops on the Underground Railroad. So in 1850, the US Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. It was part of this series of political compromises made between the Southern enslaving states and the free northern states. The act required officials arrest people suspected of being runaway slaves based on basically no evidence, and it penalized officials who did not comply. Any person who was found aiding a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was subject to 6 months in prison and a $1,000 fine. Monetary awards were offered to anyone who captured a fugitive slave, and so bounty hunting became normal. And those suspected of being runaway slaves were not eligible for a trial and could not defend themselves against any accusations. And so the result was the legalization of a national program of mass kidnapping of free Blacks across the United States. But the Fugitive Slave Act didn't extend to Canada, and so it was to Canada that thousands fled, including my grandfather's grandfather, Cornelius Thompson. So most of the people who escaped to Canada, in fact, left to go back to the United States at the end of the Civil War to find the loved ones that they left behind or who were stolen from them or lost somewhere along the way. But there are thousands of Black American refugees from slavery who stayed in southwestern Ontario, including my father's family. Because the communities were rural and segregated, my kin have the most wonderful way of speaking. My dad says theater, and he pronounces the WH in white. He talks in the same rhythms and riddles that characterize barbershop talk in African American culture. He says things like, you know, Deborah, those politicians got nothing but a nodding acquaintance with the truth. But he's also very, very Canadian, and he has a Canadian accent that appears plainly when he says about and sorry. My dad doesn't know where Cornelius escaped from. He thought he heard somebody talking about West Virginia or Alabama once, but he's skeptical. Deborah, he says, you're looking for ghosts. You're looking for evidence left behind by people who were trying to hide and whose lives depended on how well and for how long they could do it. So many of our stories are ghost stories. How could they not be? African descended people in the Americas are connected by the horrors of what we call the Middle Passage. That's the point during the route of the transatlantic slave trade in which Africans were kidnapped from their traditional territories, commodified as objects, forcibly transported across the New World, and sold as property. And so the deep of the Atlantic Ocean, the goddess Umaya's domain, it holds a place in our collective memory because there's blood in the water. It is fathoms of our dead. When I decided to move to the US over a decade ago, I thought that the ghosts of my ancestors would welcome me home. I felt like I was returning to the land of my ancestors' birth, the country that they built, where they prayed and sweated and toiled and were tortured and resisted and fought and wept as their children were stolen and sold and were traumatized as they were raped for profit and murdered for sport. The country where they died, the places that they haunt. They escaped America, and I returned to lay claim to the humanity that they were refused. I felt like I was going home. And obviously, of course, I was wrong, but maybe not in the way you might think. So what I want to share today are some of these invisible, maybe even ghostly matters that materialize in a story of coming back, both too soon and too late, and the ways that unsuspecting moments and places actually define our identities. I want to tell you some of the story of what it was like to be in the US, in the land of my ancestors, in a country that both was and was not mine, to be doubly unwanted as both an immigrant and a Black person, but there by choice and protected by incredible class privilege as a professor in a university. And then to leave, to return back to Canada, which is a country I also love, even as I think that most forms of nationalism are kind of gross. I want to acknowledge the unrepentant structural racism of American society while not negating the hidden insidious racism here in Canada. I want to relay my bewilderment and my awe at Black people's love and hope for both countries, their pride in their countries, their dedication to making these countries better, even as these countries have more often than not refused to love us back. And more than anything, I want to share what it means to be in a place, to have ancestral ties to a place, to be tied to the land, the water, the soil, and the swamp, but to be not of a place. These are the questions that I asked of myself and that audience during that first presentation in Oregon, just like I ask of myself and of you now, in the hope that maybe we can together think through what it means to lay claim to a country, to believe in freedom dreams, to seek to belong, to fight for change, even when that change means we have to abolish everything and start again. So, with that being said, let's begin again. So, Americans often think of their country as exceptional. It is one of the world's oldest democracies. It's the birthplace of revolutionary freedom. It's the only remaining superpower. It is the last line of defense in a world that's constantly threatened by dictators and demagogues. This is most famously articulated in the French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which he published in 1835. So he suggested that the idea of American exceptionalism is that American democratic ideals are somehow unparalleled, unique, or extraordinary. There's something dramatic, or maybe it's just dramatically individualistic, about the primacy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It always seemed to me to be so much more daring than Canada's motto of peace, order, and good governance. But the doctrine of American exceptionalism requires a willful ignorance about how American democracy worked for those people who were excluded from that original 18th century formulation of we the people. The self-evident truth of the liberal ideal that all men are created equal was scratched into the Declaration of Independence at the same time that nearly 20% of the population was enslaved. Now, from the vantage point of African Americans who reside in what the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois calls the Black life world, American racism makes it so that America isn't exceptionally free or equal. In fact, American racism is all the more tragic, cunning, and ruinous precisely because it exists alongside the American creed, the American dream, and the homogenizing power of American national identity. And to those of us who observe American history in the making from abroad, it seems like America is only exceptional in terms of how utterly, uncompromisingly racist it is. Now, this idea of American racial exceptionalism is particularly powerful in Canada, where we understand American racism as real and morally repulsive. And so in comparative terms, Canadian racism is either presumed to not exist, or if it does exist, it is seen as being less harmful, less depraved, less entrenched, and less traumatic than the racism in the United States. Now, there's a couple of reasons why Canadians think this way, but I think the most relevant is the way that the United States and its foundational beliefs, ideas, identities, narratives, obsessions, psychoses have in fact influenced the formation of Canadian national identity. Throughout history, we, at least in Anglophone Canada, we've struggled to form our own national identity. It's hard to share a border, language, pop culture, and media with the world's only superpower. And so for Canadians, the US is kind of like the mean girl in high school. The US is our very own Regina George. We hate her and we love her. And she's terrible, but sometimes she's not terrible to us, but she's frequently terrible to other people. But really, why won't she just pay attention to us? It hurts our national feelings that she doesn't think we're cool. And so because there are a lot of cultural similarities between Canada and the US, being Canadian is defined, at least in part, by being not American. And this has ramifications for how we understand ourselves in racial terms. The logic is something like this. Racism exists in America. Canada is not America, and so there cannot possibly be racism in Canada. We use comparison frequently, faithfully, in the service of Canadian deniability. It's, in fact, our national pastime, way more than hockey ever could be. It's an obsession that works to simultaneously hide and entrench the persistent racial inequalities that define nearly every socioeconomic indicator of Canadian life. But the cognitive dissonance required to be righteously indignant about anti-Black racism in the US, but defensive when the perpetrators are the us and not the them, is itself a particularly interesting form of Canadian racism. This denial, I think, is aided and abetted by the way that Canadian multiculturalism has become a powerful national ethos. No matter how multicultural we are, though, there's one question that non-white people get asked way more than white people do, and it is, where are you from? No, where are you really from? And if your presence in Canada has maybe never been questioned, you might not be able to hear the insinuation in the very premise of the question. Where are you really from? Because I can see you're not one of us. Where are you really from? Because you don't seem to fit in here. Where are you really from? Because I will stop you on the street and demand that you answer my question because I am white and you are not. And deep down, I believe you owe me your time, your benevolence, your patience, your attention, and your respect. Where are you really from? Because my curiosity is much more important than your comfort or your safety. Where are you really from? Because how long you've been in this country will tell me something about your place in this country. Where are you really from? Because you cannot possibly be from here. For years, Black Canadian scholars have explored what we call the absented presence of Blackness in Canada. The absented part describes the way that Black people in Canada are always assumed to not exist, or if we do exist, we are assumed to be recent arrivals to what has always been a white country. Catherine McKittrick writes that Blackness in Canada is always unexpected, always surprising. Blackness is surprising, she writes, because it should not be here, was not here before, was always here, is only momentarily here, was always over there, beyond Canada, for example. This means then that Black people in Canada are also presumed surprises because they are not here and here simultaneously. So if we think of it this way, the question, where are you really from, is an attempt to address the shock and the astonishment of seeing Blackness in a place where it is not supposed to be. But Blackness in Canada isn't just absent, it's absented, it's a verb. To be absented rather than just absent implicates the involvement of political processes that bring conditions into being. Our invisibility in national mythologies, it's not a coincidence, nor is it a mistake, but is rather a purposeful crafting of a vision of the Canadian nation that renders Black people invisible. Now, the presence part of absented presence implicates the ways that narratives of Canadian identity depend on the existence of Black Canada, even as they erase it. The idea of Canada as the promised land, as the destination for fugitive slaves who escaped America following the North Star, as a safe haven from the tyranny of American racism, as a contemporary multicultural paradise, or perhaps the world's only successful racial democracy. These are fundamental foundational parables of the Canadian imagination, and they depend on the existence of an allegorical Black Canada, but just not too many Black people, of course, and not angry Black people or radical Black people or ungrateful Black people or loud Black people or Black people who remember the razing of Africville in Halifax or Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, or Black people who point out the ways that Canada tolerates Blackness only begrudgingly. And this is part of the reason why a sense of real belonging was, for me, always quite elusive here in Canada. And so the kind of belonging that I always sought in the country of my birth, I instead tried to find in the country that enslaved my ancestors. So Many immigrants experience a culture shock when they move to their new country. Maybe it's a different climate, different language, different culture, different norms. And this obviously wasn't a problem for me when I moved from Canada to the US, except that I underestimated the power of the narcissism of minor differences. So this is a Freudian theory and the idea is that communities that have adjoining territories and close relationships are especially likely to engage in feuds and mutual ridicule because they're hypersensitive to the pretty minute differences that actually differentiate them. Now, there's some differences between Canada and the US that everyone knows about. Ketchup chips exist in Canada. We use Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. Nobody understands Fahrenheit, just like nobody understands the Electoral College. The way that every Canadian has said to an American friend, did you know that Ryan Reynolds is actually Canadian? Or that was filmed in Vancouver, actually. And it turned out that a lot of what I knew about American culture came straight out of pop culture. And so when I began living in the US and became integrated into American culture for real, I was surprised to find out a few things. Cheerleaders are real. Who knew? If you grew up around the same time that I did and watched any sitcom on Thursday night, you would think that New York is a white-only urban party scene, but it turns out New York is actually, there are Black people in New York too. Who knew? Portlandia is surprisingly accurate. I lived in the US for 10 years. I lived in Boston, the birthplace of the American Revolution. I moved to southeastern Ohio in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. I lived in Chicago, the great Black metropolis, and then Oregon, the western frontier. I met amazing people. I taught amazing students, and it was really an incredible experience. But there were also some parts about being a Canadian in America that I could never quite wrap my head around. So this is a bill for my daughter's birth. I had never heard the words pre-existing condition or copay before I moved to the US, and I had no idea what a deductible could possibly mean in the context of healthcare. I got used to asking whether or not there were guns in people's households before I let my daughter go to a play date or any birthday party. But it was when she started having active shooter drills in her preschool that I knew we couldn't stay. I never really understood how or why, but it was always quite clear to me that Americans believe in the American dream. They believe that their society is fundamentally a meritocracy. And if you work hard, you can, in fact, be anything. But they also implicitly believe that the opposite is true. So if you are poor, if you are homeless, if you are sick, if you are destitute, if you are vulnerable, you just must not have worked hard enough. One of the most consequential differences, though, I think, between Canada and the US is the manifestation of structural racism. We often think about people as being racist or behaving in racist ways, slurs that are shouted on the street. And that happens there and it happens here. But racism is not just a function of individual attitudes. We can't eradicate racism just by changing hearts and minds. Racism is the social, legal, economic, and political distinctions that mark and maintain unequal entry and access points to privacy, property, prosperity, protection, and personhood. Racism is systemic, which means that it is deeply embedded in our institutions, in our laws and policies, in our social norms, and even our ideas about who deserves what. Racism has shaped the contours of every major social, legal, political, economic system in the United States, every single one. If you name me an institution, I can tell you its racist history, from banking and real estate to the location of highways and grocery stores, from the funding of K-12 education, the origins of the Second Amendment, and the lack of anything that comes close to universal health care. Racism has literally touched every facet of American society in ways that I didn't understand until I got there. But a funny thing emerged from the ashes of the Black experience in the United States. The core idea of African American identity and culture is the struggle against racism. And it's not just for us, it's for everyone. There's another side to this too. I was once doing a presentation like this in Canada at a university that I won't name, but it was Queen's. And after it finished, an older couple came up to me and they said, "Don't worry, we didn't think you were Black until you mentioned it." And they meant it as a compliment. And it was so Canadian of them. There is, I think, a value to the exploration of Blackness in Canada and the US, not in contrast, but rather in relation to one another. Ideas and inspirations, people and profits, goods and grievances have crossed the border for centuries. And so too, Black freedom dreams have never been bound by national borders. And so while others compare racism in the US to these obvious circumstances of racial apartheid, like in Nazi Germany or South Africa, I think that the insistence in Canada that racism doesn't exist here or that it happened a long time ago and doesn't happen anymore requires a kind of national ignorance, what the poet Dion Brand calls a stupefying innocence, that itself is worthy of careful examination. Extreme cases have a lot to tell us, but so do unsuspecting ones. And Canadian peculiarities make for interesting politics. So Black communities in Canada are both very old, predating Canada by over 100 years, and they're also very new, growing only exponentially in the mid to late 1990s. The population is quite small at 3.5% of the national population, but significant in cities like Halifax, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. We are the diaspora of the diaspora, so to speak. Both old and new Black communities are the products of global collusions and imperial collisions of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, but we do not have in Black Canada the same level of political or cultural recognition as African Americans do, nor do we have the millions, like the magnitude of the millions that comprise the African descended populations of the Caribbean or South America. In Canada, we also have a unique kind of racial consciousness, and that's the result of multiple formulations of Blackness in Canada that are crisscrossed with nationality, ethnicity, language, immigrant status, class, religion, and more, but which also shaped by those convergences, frictions, and translations of the shifting contours of Canadian culture and society. Organizing and creating solidarity within the Black community can be difficult here in Canada, but also is full of potential, the potential that comes with recognizing authentically contradictory versions of the Black experience. Blackness in Canada also exists within the crucible of Canadian exceptionalism. That is, Canada the exceptional, Canada the clearly not racist, Canada the good, Canada the white savior, Canada the successful multicultural experiment. The dismissiveness of racism is part of the appeal, because if Canada is the exception to global racial rule, then we have no need to examine our exceptionally Canadian racial rules. It's a distraction, of course, because Canadian racism is shaped not just by a global history that gives it a familiar force and feeling, but also by those specificities that make it Canadian born and bred, just like me. And so it's an open question then about how Canadian racism is shaped by Canadian democracy, Canadian political structures, Canadian liberalism, Canadian whiteness, Canadian politeness, Canadian public policy, Canadian political parties, Canadian political culture, Canadian popular culture, Canadian urban centers, Canadian regionalism, Canadian ruralism, Canadian media, Canadian peacekeeping, Canadian war making, Canadian bilingualism, Canadian settler colonialism, and the Canadian national inferiority complex. Moreover, racism in Canada doesn't necessarily manifest in the same way that systemic racism manifests in the United States. Racism here is highly malleable. It's hard to pin down. It is purposeful exclusion, caveated tolerance, and predatory inclusion. It is invisibility and hypervisibility. Racism is operationalized by the differential effects of universalistic laws and policies, the informalities and discretions that are built into systems of power, hidden entry points, overly emphasized exit ramps, and normalized patterns of behavior that are excused away because this is just the way things have always been done here, Debra. Canadian racism is state action that deliberately limits movement, the accumulation of wealth or access to opportunities, and it is also when governments choose to not act and instead let racist systems remain undisturbed. It is selective interest, sustained indifference, and messages of personal choice that naturalize racial inequality as a consequence of individual failings. It is government and protection and benefits that are hard to access or that are withdrawn without reason. It is the co-optation of radical demands in order to make them more palatable, marketable, and profitable. The truth is, there is just a lot we don't know about the nuances of anti-Black racism in Canada, in part because it is so consistently jettisoned into the realm of that which is unthinkable and unspeakable. But it's real, it exists, it's consequential, and that's not just my opinion. That's also the way that racism functions in the Canadian context. People tend to think that this is just my opinion and everyone has an opinion on race. This is not my opinion. This is 20 years of research. I came back to Canada during a particular moment. Some people called it a racial reckoning, harkened by death, substantiated through struggle, haunted by the conceptual space between what was imaginable and what was later revealed as possible. We didn't know then what had come crashing into the public sphere, full of chaos and fury, and later, predictably, dilution and co-optation. Even now, we are years removed from the uprisings in the summer of 2020, and we don't have a coherent narrative to explain why it was the world stopped to grieve, to rage, to rebel, to mourn together. I started writing my book during that moment when protests in Minneapolis and LA, New York and Toronto, Montreal and London seemed like they were a seismic disruption with the potential to catalyze finally an acknowledgement that white supremacy was born and bred in the global sphere, an understanding that racism can manifest in the realm of ideas and can move across borders as easily as the wind, an appreciation that historic context and local circumstances still matter, but they are nevertheless inflected with lessons and lesions from elsewhere, a resurrection of the disruptive and fracturing, compounding and conflicting potential of diasporic solidarity. Reckoning, I think, is maybe not the right word for all that's happened between then and now. The idea of a reckoning is about honored promises, debts repaid, and a balance restored. We also use the word to reckon as a verb to express dreams and expectations, just as readily as a reckoning also faces the past again and again, like the way our return involves circling back to the beginning of a journey. What's clear now, I think, is that the moment that we were once in has now passed. The moment we are in now is much less clearly defined, much more indeterminate. It's a moment when, as David Scott writes, quote, old horizons have collapsed or evaporated and new ones have not yet taken shape, end quote. We are in a time of speculation and flux, vulnerability and risk, incoherence, and therefore a possibility. It is what the cultural theorists called a politics without guarantees. And so take heed, we might not like what emerges on the other side of this moment. Racial progress has always been shadowed by disproportionate backlash. And I think we are in that moment of backlash right now. It manifests as the attack on critical race theory, the death threats that have been sent to Black Canadian journalists, the use of woke as a disparaging slur, the insistence that white professors have the academic freedom to use the N-word in their classrooms. It is the dilution that turned radical demands to rethink what we mean by justice to nothing more than EDI trainings. It is as much the benign neglect of the state as it is the collective shrug of Canadians everywhere about the predetermined failure or the purposeful sabotage of so many of the initiatives that we hoped would change our workplaces, our education system, our social moorings, our access to substantive democratic belonging. But nothing would have happened had Black people and our allies not taken to the streets in the summer of 2020. As the great orator Frederick Douglass once said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And at what is the beginning, not the middle, and not the end of this most recent iteration of backlash against racial progress, the very least we can do is remember and try to make sense of all that was and all that still might be. So if I'm telling the truth here, using my experiences as an entry point into a broader inquiry about race, Blackness, and belonging makes me deeply, deeply uncomfortable. I'm actually a very private person, even though I wrote what is called a memoir. But the epigraph of my book is Dion Brand, who says, we don't write about racism, we write about life. We don't write only about racism. We write about life, impossible life, improbable life. We live together here in the impossible. We can struggle towards other impossible things with other impossible people. No one is illegal. No one is illegal on stolen land. Give the land back. We have done impossible things before. The abolition of slavery once seemed impossible. The end of colonialism once seemed impossible. The end of apartheid in South Africa once seemed impossible. The fall of the Soviet Union once seemed impossible. Impossible things are in our DNA. In Black studies, and therefore in Black politics, storytelling is tradition, repetition is sacred, and writing is the process of turning bewilderment into awe. The discipline is one in which our methodological anchors are narratives, songs, groove, tempos, continuities, ruptures, ghosts, and hauntings, and in which the data that we're interested in is not readily or easily quantified or coded. Black studies is a discipline in which our citational practices are not just about showing what we know, but are rather about unknowingness. We cite those who came before us to show the path that we walked, to show what we once didn't know, but now know better, to demonstrate how it is we came to know how much or little that we think we might know. Black studies as vocation isn't just interdisciplinary, but is in fact anti-disciplinary and undisciplinary in that we seek the knowledge through which we can achieve racial justice in this world, or we will remake it so those who follow can. And this is an important point as universities seek to hire Black scholars into traditional disciplines. If you want us, but you don't want our established ways of thinking, which we have been writing about for over half a century, then what you don't want is us. What you actually want is more of you. Now, the truest thing about travel and movement, as anyone who's ever gone anywhere can tell you, is how people change as they move. Our identities, our understandings of belonging and home, they're never fixed. They're never once and for all. So the very idea of a return is kind of the stuff of fairy tales. It is a futility of the highest order to go back to a place where you once were, but no longer are, and yet desire to be. No one can ever really go home again, not because home changes, but because you do. Thank you for listening. That's all I have. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Debra. That was such an informative and poetic presentation. I know that there will be many, many questions from the audience. And so just a reminder to our audience, you can put your questions in the chat or you can raise your hand and we will call on you to unmute yourself. And I am going to pass over to Alejandro, who is going to facilitate our Q&A.
Thank you, Veronica. And thank you, Debra. That was amazing.
Thank you.
I know it's difficult to speak after that, but please ask questions.
Oh yeah, we're waiting for questions.
Yeah.
Do people just put them in the chat? Is that,
The
or
chat,
are people
yeah.
raising their hands? Poetry in motion, thank you. I am not a poet. I am a political scientist, friends. I mean, like in theory. I don't know if I'm actually a political scientist.
So we have Sylvia Mange. Sylvia, please.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
You think we will know by now. That was amazing, Debra. That was really very insightful, although painful as well. But it's something that you did know. I want to, because you didn't get too much into the personal you in the presentation, which is fine, no problem. But I want to ask you about, but you did get into personal you, but I would just want to ask you, how do you feel now that you're back here in Canada? I would just like you tell us the differences that you may feel as Black in America and Black in Canada. You know, those differences that there are not so much research or academics, but more on the personal level, please.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that question. I have 2 children under 8, so most of the time I feel tired. I will say is my predominant feeling is that I am tired. About the differences between being Black in Canada and the Black in the US, you know, it was so strange. It was so funny because when I decided to move back to Canada, so many of my friends reached out and they were like, we're so happy you're moving back. We're so relieved. You know, I moved during the Trump presidency. Folks were very relieved. And I obviously had like very, very mixed feelings about it. In part because I loved my time in the US. You know, like there were a lot of racist things that happened. I write about them in my book. I can talk about them more if you're interested. But I really, really enjoyed my time in the US. And I think it was in part because I have when I talk about this, some Black folks like find themselves. So let me say that like I grew up in Oshawa, Ontario, which is like it's about half an hour east of Toronto. It's a little bit too far to be considered a suburb of Toronto. And like I'm in my 40s. And so when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, like Oshawa was not a diverse place. And even if you talk to my dad and ask him about growing up in Toronto in the 50s and 60s, my dad says, you know, if you saw another Black person in Toronto in the 50s, then you were probably related to them because there were so few Black people in the country at that point. And I grew up as frequently as like the only one. I write about, this is the second chapter of my book, is called The Only One. And it's about being like, I was Black. I was like often the only or one of very, very few Black people in any space, you know? And so that was my childhood was spent that way. You know, my university, like when I started working for the federal government, there were very few Black people working for the federal government in the early aughts. There still are very few Black people working for the federal government. And in graduate school, you know, like I really was the only Black person in sight. And it didn't make me feel like special or unique. It made me feel like I had to work twice as hard to get half as much, you know, which is something my dad always like said to me, like point blank, you know, like you're a Black person, you need to work twice as hard to get half as much. So you better be working twice as hard, was kind of his approach to it. And I moved to the US, and part of the reason why I felt part of the reason I loved being there was because I had a Black community for the first time. You know, this is not everyone's experience. You know, like I have friends who grew up in like Little Burgundy in Montreal or like parts of Toronto, and they were surrounded by other folks who looked like them, who could understand, but that was like not my experience. And it was, you know, it was really isolating. It led to a sense that like I frequently felt like I was being like gaslit because racist things would happen to me and no one would acknowledge them, you know, like even like when I had the courage, and I frequently didn't, so we were clear, I frequently didn't have the courage to call out racist things, or I didn't even recognize racist things as they were happening to me, you know, like really. And when I did call it out, it was denied, you know, like people would just be like, that's not like you're you know, like literally that's you know, of course that's not like you're being overly sensitive or something like that. One of the other differences, and I'll just end here, is really I'm a professor, as I assume some of you are in the audience. I teach courses on the politics of race, and there is a very different level of knowledge that my students come into the classroom with. And in the United States, everybody knows that racism exists. Like even the racists know that racism exists, you know. And in Canada, I think that we have a dominant approach to racism, which is really one of like deniability. Like it's not here. It doesn't, or if it does exist, it's not as traumatic. It's not as entrenched. There's not a long history. Folks don't know the history of this country. If they do know their history, they think that racism was eradicated at, like, I don't know, when in 1971, when Trudeau stood up and declared Canada to be multicultural. And that's a very different starting point. Like to begin kind of any talk on racism by having to convince people it exists, that's a very, very different starting point than my work in the US, where like we could get on to more interesting conversations because everybody had that baseline acknowledgement. So like that, those are the two things that stand out to me here.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat from Sora Halani. So, what has been a pivotal narrative when you discuss racism with non-Black colleagues?
So a very, very brief story. Oh my gosh, I had forgotten about this. Back when Facebook was used in a different way, this is like 2014, 2013, I posted something, and it was around the time that Freddie Gray was murdered. Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore by 6 Baltimore police officers. And I posted something, and like the vitriol on my Facebook wall was incredible. And I remember talking to my friend. I was working at Ohio University at the time. I remember talking to a friend of mine who's also a professor in political science, and he was like, what is with your Canadian friends? Like, what? He's like, are these your friends from high school? Like, what is happening? And I was like, no. These are my friends with PhDs. Like, these are friends who are very, very well educated folks who do not believe that racism exists. Like, and he was just so surprised. He's like, man, like, I think most Americans know that, you know, structural racism is a thing. Like, I think, you know, later on we were kind of proven that most Americans, in fact, did not know that structural racism is a thing after 2020. But my reaction to my colleagues in that particular moment was shock. And like, look, like I write about this in my book as well. Like being in universities, we are surrounded by a particular kind of whiteness, which I name in the book as kind of like liberal whiteness. And it's very dangerous. I write about this a lot in the book, in part because when I was in Ohio, I lived in Athens, Ohio, which is a very small college town that's surrounded by, like, it's very, very white. It's the county votes Republican. You know, there were like Confederate flags everywhere, even though Ohio was not part of the Confederacy. And it, you know, and I was always quite worried. And I think, you know, there were some incidents that happened with the white folks in the surrounding community. But really the most damaging things when I was in Ohio came from like my white liberal colleagues. And there are folks who thought of themselves as being very, very progressive. But when it came down to it, they ended up reifying, you know, both intentionally and unintentionally, like racist things. And in a lot of cases were in fact the perpetrators of racism, if I can say that, against me, you know, and it was terrible. It was really awful because there was always this like plausible deniability. Like there were folks who were, you know, like the head of like women and gender studies was a white woman who was like awful to me. and spread rumors about me, you know, like throughout the university, and would say things like, you know, like Deb Thompson, like she's so full of herself. And I was like, man, I'm full of myself because I am like literally an expert, you know, like I'm, you know, but like these like the betrayals I felt, you know, from white liberal colleagues were so traumatic, in part because it was always like this like progressive plausible deniability, that anything was happening, or that like the university itself was implicated, or that these spaces were harmful, you know. And so I guess if I can round this up by saying the reaction to non-Black colleagues has been quite mixed, especially in spaces where my non-Black colleagues consider themselves to be progressive. And so we're clear, when I talk about white liberals, anyone can be a white liberal. I don't think of whiteness as like a phenological characteristic. I think about whiteness as a power relationship.
Yeah, there is a question from Jasmine in the chat. Jasmine, I wonder if you want to mute and to ask the question yourself. I think you're going to ask better than me.
Oh, okay, sure. First of all, thank you. I appreciate that you highlight how Canada's democracy influences Canadian racism. Would you be able to speak more about how peace, order, and good governance has shaped how Canada's colonial violence has transformed or shapeshift today, how it manifests today, particularly through that principle of peace, order, and good governance? Yeah.
Oh my gosh, thank you for this question. So I'm going to give you two responses, and one is going to be more coherent than the other. The first more coherent response is like, when I think about peace, order, and good governance, I think about the role of the RCMP and the police, who are largely ones responsible for maintaining social order, and community safety, whatever that means. And I talk about this with my students all the time, in part because like I love that Weberian definition of the state, in which he, you know, Weber being like a very famous German sociologist, and he defined the state as an entity that maintains a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence in a given territory. And I always talk about that. I love that definition of the state because it puts violence at the core of what states do. And this idea that there is like a legitimate use of a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence, like that's the police, you know, and that's like the military. That's like those are the folks who have the power of the state behind their actions. If anyone else did what the police do, we would call it assaults, we'd call it murder in some cases, we'd call it breaking and entering, you know, like we would have other names for the ways in which police go about their business. And when you have a society that is racially ordered, right, in which like there is a racial hierarchy, the role of the police becomes to protect that social order. And it's not saying like police officers are bad people, like that's not it. Like it is just like the function of the police is to maintain social order, and embedded within that social order is racial hierarchies. And so that's what I think of when I think of peace, order, and good governance. The second, less coherent answer I'm going to give is because I'm still thinking about it. I was talking with my students about the manifestations of Canadian whiteness a couple weeks ago, and it came to me that Canadians think of our society as being more equal, right? As being like more egalitarian than other countries, as being a fair society, especially when compared to the US, like it's a fairer society. And this is in fact borne out in a lot of the research, right? Like we don't have the same kind of extraordinary gaps between the rich and the poor. Like there are very real wealth gaps, and they are coded by race. They manifest in racial terms. And there are, you know, and while in Canada, the function of the welfare state has been that poor people have not been getting poorer over the past 30 or 40 years, rich people have in fact been getting much richer, right? So the gap is still there, and it is in fact growing. But because Canadians think of our country as being more egalitarian and more fair, in some ways, ideas of Canada as a meritocracy are even more persistent and more deeply entrenched here, which is why like the idea that what we actually need to rectify some of these circumstances of racism is targeted action, like employment equity, you know, which is Canada's name for affirmative action, like specific scholarships for Black or Indigenous people, like, you know, settlements, you know, that hopefully Indigenous people can just like have and not have to sue the government for, the government coming like kicking and screaming the entire way, right? Like those ideas like strike Canadians as being undemocratic, in part because we believe our country is in fact more fair. And the irony, of course, is that Canada is, it's not any more or less egalitarian than other countries, but the parliamentary system of government means that so much of what we do here is hidden, and you cannot get access to data on the realities of racism in a lot of circumstances if like your life depended on it. And so like that's my general like incoherent thoughts on like peace, order, and good governance in Canada, is that we govern by stealth, we govern through secrecy, and that's endemic to parliamentary systems of government, and embedded within that secrecy is racial hierarchy. That's a really incoherent response, but that's what I'm thinking about these days.
That was not incoherent at all. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much for those answers, Debra. Thank you for the questions. So now I would like to invite Veronica to close the session.
Thank you, Alejandro. I'm sorry that we're out of time and we have to close this really amazing presentation and conversation. So thank you again, Dr. Thompson, for being here today, sharing your incredibly rich and evocative presentation on Blackness and belonging with us this morning. Also want to thank you, Alejandro, for your organization of this session, our communication staff, of course, and our media services for their support and organization of the event also. And then I just want to thank everyone who joined today for being here, for spending this time sharing this space and bringing your questions. And I just wish everyone a really good rest of the day, and thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.